everyone and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for tuning in today. If you like the channel, consider to hit the subscribe button and support the channel by turning on your notifications or recommending this channel to a friend or family member that you think would benefit from the content. And of course, give this video a like and do comment whatever you think is relevant or whatever you think should be talked about in other videos. In this video, I would like to address the problem of the self in Jung's psychology. So this is a problem that is quite difficult, it's quite complex, so we will probably not get through the whole material. And I want to keep it brief and sort of parse it into different pieces, because I think it deserves much more attention. It has been gravely misunderstood in the literature that is sort of out there. So let's get right into it. The self, as opposed to the ego, is the objective kernel of the psyche. So if you think about the ego, you have to think about the subjective kernel of the psyche insofar as the ego constructs a narrative, I always say, a story, around the sort of elements that are part of it, right? So that's the level of the ego. It's subjective in as far as it is driven by the subject. It is constructed by the subject, by that which we think of as ourselves, right? And that is not to say that we can choose whatever is part of the narrative that we construct as the ego, but it is not given, right? It is not there. It is not, let's say, it is not without influence. Let's put it that way, okay? So what then is the self as the objective kernel? Well, archetypally, the self is, let's say, put into image as a god, as a deity. That's why Jung calls it the God image or the Godhead, right? But I don't want to sort of stop there and just say, okay, the self is the Godhead. It's this sort of this super structure that drives or propels the ego, or that the ego develops towards, because that is sort of what is commonly interpreted, or that is what the self is commonly interpreted as. Instead, what I would like to propose to you is the following perspective. What we have been discussing in other videos, and if you haven't watched those, you can check them out here. I'll link them also in the description of this video. We've been discussing that the ego is essentially the interpretive function that sits at the center of a network, and this network is made up of psychic complexes, or elements as we call them sometimes. These psychic complexes have at their core an archetypal core, right, an archetypal kernel. And around that, content is built that you encounter in your life, in your everyday sort of, when you move through the world, you encounter this content, right? It's what basically the fabric that you add to the flesh, you add to the bone, and the bone is the archetype in a way, right? The archetypal core. That is, the archetype in itself is no image. There's nothing in it. There's no content to it. It's just the trajectory, sort of the vessel that can be filled with content. And this content has to be sort of localized. The archetype, if you think about it as a global structure, is something that everyone shares. It has to be localized within every person's individual sort of life and encounter with the environment that the archetype has once been born from, or born in interaction with. Okay. So what does this have to do with the self, right? The idea is that the self sits in the specific, in the individual composition of these general tendencies. So if you think about it, a musical instrument, a guitar or a violin or a cello or a piano or whatever, but let's stick with sort of these instruments that have bodies, right? Like corpuses, if you will. Let's stick with the guitar, for example. A guitar has a body, right, sort of a resonance, a body of resonance. And this body of resonance is pretty much the same across all guitars if you take the mean of it, right? They move around as sort of a mean. But in their individual expression, you know, the use of the wood, the specific use of the curves and edges, the size, maybe the rigidity of the sort of the structure, it differs. That makes the sound of each guitar unique. And of course, this has many more dimensions and it's reductionist, but if you think about it in the most general terms, this is how we could think about the relationship of the self to the general collective unconscious. So the self is a subset, a microcosm of the collective unconscious. It contains all the elements that the collective unconscious contains, but it is localized, as it were, in a first step already in the subject, right? So the subject, if you will, if you think about this in sort of very esoterical terms, you can say that the subject is born with a certain color palette, right? If you think about the world soul or the archetypal space, let's say the collective unconscious as the world soul, then the individual soul is a subset of that. And it contains all the colors, but it contains them in their individual sort of shades. And those shades and the composition of them differ per individual and make them individual as they are in the self that they represent. Okay, so then what exactly is at the core of these complexes, right? And you have to think, this is essentially what is at the very fundament of your personality or your psyche, as Jung would put it, right? This is the very core of what you are, right? It's, if you think about the ego is simply sitting on top of all of this pool of complexes and narrates them and sort of attempts to find and construct a linearity between them, a story that it can weave, in which it can weave them together. And this coherence, the creation of this coherence, the creation of this linearity is the function of the ego. There is no content to the ego itself. It is simply the creation of this linearity that is its function, right? And so it's essentially like an empty, if you will, reflex moving through space, like with nothing more to it than that. And it only is brought to life by the encounter of content within the world. And that content, again, is brought to life by the enchantment with energy that is provided by the kernels around which it clusters. And these kernels are what we have referred to as the archetypes, right? And the archetypes are the structural units of the collective unconscious. And here now comes the self into play. The manifestation of these archetypes or their specific expression within the individual psyche is what the self represents. So the self represents essentially the composition of these separate archetypes within or within the complexes. So if you think about it in metaphorical terms, which I always think is a beautiful metaphor, it's the body of resonance that you are provided with. Like it provides the fundament of that which can resonate, the specific way the melody of the world can play on through you, if you will. And I think this is such a beautiful metaphor because it plays on to the energetic aspect, the energizing aspect of these archetypes, of these kernels, right? And this energetic or energizing aspect is essentially described by Jung as, psychic energy or libido is, or but psychic energy for that matter, libido was a term Jung didn't really use, at least not in his later work. Psychic energy is captured within these kernels, within the complexes, but to be precise, at the core of the complexes, that is, in their archetypal kernel. And so it expresses, obviously, energy can express in the encounter with situations, in thoughts, in certain general, tendencies. And we can think about this in very plain biological terms as energy being tied up in the drives, right? If you go back to drive theory, you can think about it as this idea that energy is tied up in the drive. And you have the drive, you want to eat, you're hungry, you want to satisfy that drive, so you'll have energy to go and satisfy that drive and move towards homeostasis, if you will. Right? Of course, this theory has been largely, it's not complete, right? And Jung adds to this the psychological dimension, where he basically says there is a drive or an archetype, as he goes, for every situation that's been encountered throughout the history of human existence. And now the idea is that you have, of course, an infinite amount of situations in the human existence, but the idea is that the more frequent this encounter has been, the more solidified or crystallized this archetype has become in our psyche. So if you think about some of the most fundamental human experiences that are not even human, like they stretch way back, they don't even have anything specifically to do with the human condition, but they have something to do with being a mammal, perhaps with being a living being on this planet, and this would be the act of being born, the act of dying, right? The problem of hunger, the problem of thirst, the problem of procreation, finding a mate and mating. That has multiple aspects, right? You want to sort of attract a mate, and then you want to engage in the act of mating. Then you have the act of fatherhood, the act of motherhood, again, the act of bringing a new life to the world. And so we could think about these, nurturing someone, being nurtured oneself, being afraid, being hunted, hunting, like all these sort of, sleeping. The list could go on forever, All these sort of, this would be when we say, like, these are archetypal situations, right, colloquially, what we mean is those situations occurred over and over again throughout the span of our history as humans, right? And, for Jung, an archetypal situation could be anything. In fact, and this is very relevant, I think, for everyone to understand, anything could become an archetypal situation if it was experienced or ingrained in the psyche for a long enough time. That means experienced over a long stretch of time, over and over again, in similar ways. It doesn't have to be the same way, because I always think of this process as sort of the trickling down of water, like rainwater trickling down or filtering through the soil to then at some point become this really distilled or essential, if you will, groundwater, right? It's this sort of this process of trickling down and distilling out the essence that essentially, in my opinion, or in my sort of this metaphorical view, makes up the process of something becoming archetypal. Now, the question really that I want to address in this video, and that I opened with as well, is the question, then how does the self express? Or if you think of the self as sort of this individualized or localized universal of the archetype, right? So it's sort of a fragment of that. It's your individual biological expression of that. Then how does your body of resonance, how does that express? Like, what does it look like practically? And so here, the idea of energy comes in handy to some extent. And the question that we've also addressed in some other videos of how does the unconscious act upon the ego in general? How does that look? What does that look like? And the answer here, I think, and I'm not sure, but this is how I read it, and I think this is quite, I don't know if this is the common reading of Jung, I don't think so, but I think the interaction between these two entities is by a rupture. Like you have essentially this circle of individuation that we've also discussed in other videos, right? This descent, right? This the ego goes through the cycle where the ego experiences a certain hubris, a certain moment where it believes itself to be in total charge, let's say, right? This is comparable to the myth of Icarus that flies up to the sun, right, and then his wings get burned, and he crashes, right? In this moment in which he thinks he can fly up to the sun, he can become a god, let's say, a godlike demigod, or whatever he is in actuality, transcend, so to speak. That is the moment of hubris. It's this moment in which you believe you are in absolute charge. And this, I mean, in superstitious terms, like we'd say colloquially, like, oh my God, now I've jinxed this, or something like that. Like you'd say, oh, I can't say it. I can't tell anyone about this success that's coming up because I'll jinx it, or I'll make it go away. Because, if you're too confident of something, or we'll say, oh my God, I feel so healthy, well, let me knock on wood, or something like that. Because like we're scared that we will destroy sort of the numinosity of this energy, will take the energy away by sort of expressing it. And this already in itself is, I think, an interesting moment of care that the ego takes not to fall prey to its own hubris, to its own sort of the over-exaggeration of its own power, if you will. And on the other hand, we all the time we over exaggerate that power all the time. It's like when you're about to get sick and you're still like, I'm not gonna get sick. I'm gonna fight this. I'm gonna go and I'm gonna be healthy now and go for a walk and exercise. And you know that the only thing that's gonna happen is it's gonna make you more sick. And that's an example of hubris in that. And the fall that follows hubris, the fall of Icarus, or the catastrophe or the rejection, as you would call it as you could also call it in Jungian terms, is this moment when you then do get sick. So when the ego's expectation or almost hypothesis of being all powerful is disappointed or not satisfied. And in that moment, what happens is you fall. And where do you fall? Well, you fall to the underworld. You fall in a place of chaos in which you don't know how to orient yourself, because an assumption that you as ego had as a component of the linearity that you have constructed, the story you've written about yourself, I will be healthy tomorrow so I can exercise today. An element of that story is sort of erased. It breaks away. It's not only erased, but it's specifically attacked. It's specifically, I say ruptured. And what that does is it leaves a hole, a gap in the story that you've been telling, right? And this gap has to be filled. Otherwise, the story can continue. Like, otherwise, you'd be disoriented. You'd move through the world and be like, what the hell's going on? Like, I don't know how to orient myself. I don't know how to, like, navigate this world, because there's something about me is missing. Like, I can't count on my body's continuity, let's say, because I've fallen sick even though I thought I wouldn't. And so how do I deal with this? And in such small instances, it's quite easy. But let's say you lose your job, or let's say you find out your wife has been cheating on you and you've been married for like 30 years. That is a tough situation to figure out. Like, how are you going to reconcile that gap, right? And so that's a descent into the underworld, into chaos. And this and then of course that descent is a descent into towards the kernel of the complex that's at stake. And it doesn't mean you're ever going to reach the kernel. That's totally out of the picture, I think. What it means is you're going to sort of work through the layers and layers of flesh that you build around that bone. So the layers and layers of content that you filled that archetype with, and attempt to find out what's going on here. Who am I? What is this really about? And you can think of this, I think quite a good modern picture is, when you have something traumatic, I call this a trauma, and I've made a video on this here. So if you have something traumatic like this happen, what we often do in modernity, I guess, is you take your phone and you scroll through old pictures. It's like, is this really, like, what happened to me last night? Like, let me check this and like sort of go through the pictures, and you look at old pictures and you reestablish this image of yourself. You reestablish this linearity that you have had before. And so here is and what you do thereby is you move closer and closer to the bone. Like, the more often this rupture occurs, the better you know the complex, right? The better you know the flesh. And once you've navigated the flesh, you can pretty clearly see the bone. It becomes sort of transparent. You can see through it because you understand its structure. It's no longer this narrative of the ego that sort of interprets the flesh and the bone, but it's now the bone itself speaking, and through that is the energy of the kernel that speaks, right? And so here's the important point now. The ruptures, so the moments in which sort of something is activated, something is ruptured in the ego, the energy for that stems from the kernel of the complex. So there's an archetypal situation, for example, for getting sick, right? It's an archetypal moment if you fall ill. That's archetypal because it's happened throughout the history of human existence. It's a human condition. We've gotten sick all the time. And so now in this moment, what occurs is this kernel, this archetypal, this millions of year-long history activates the complex around it, so that which you have experienced in your own life with getting sick, it endows that with energy, and with that energy it springs forth into your towards your ego and sort of ruptures that. And so here's I think we see the way in which the self acts. Right now we can sort of close the bridge or build the bridge towards the self. Like, this video is on the self, what the hell, I haven't mentioned it. So, but the whole point is that if these archetypal kernels are the individualized, the localized expressions of the collective unconscious, that is to say, the self, right? Then, and the ruptures of the ego have their origin within those kernels as energy providing sources, mediated through the content, then, and the ego is driven by these ruptures to consider closely the complexes and thereby also the kernels around which they build, then I think the mechanism in which the self sort of enforces itself or presents itself to the psyche as a whole is by way of these ruptures. And so this is the sort of the fundamental argument I want to make. It's not that the self is sort of this distant goal that we move towards, but it's more this continuously punctuating sort of, antidote, if you will, to the ego. It's this antithesis to the ego. And it is precisely that which the ego is not yet, right? It's a confrontation with that which the ego has to still become. And so I'm just looking for a few quotes here. Well, indifferent of quotes, but I think the self it neither precedes nor does it succeed the ego in its existence, but it's a parallel entity that exists with the ego and sort of propels its development. It's almost, I would say, this sort of vortex-like movement. I always compare this to the ego sort of circles around this kernel. This is another spatial metaphor, but by way of basically engaging in this transcendence, so moving up towards itself, right? And then descending again, moving up again, descending again into the underworld after the rupture, ascending again into hubris, descending again into the underworld, ascending again. And what do we get? Descending, ascending, descending. We get a circle, right? And the circle, I would, and what does the circle move around? Well, the kernels, right? And so if we move around, if you take the mean of all movements around all kernels across all complexes in the psyche, you get sort of the movement around the whole of it. And this whole, in this instance, would be the self, right? And so the idea here is, of course, that this sort of vortex-like movement is in this sense, it's driven by two compulsions, if you will. The one compulsion on the one hand is the compulsion of the ego to reestablish itself. So the ego is compulsively, if you will, develops it's this linear narrative. It has to do that in order to function in society. That's what it does. It's like a reflex, right? You can't shut it off either. It just doesn't work. Like, try shutting off your ego. I mean, it takes a lot of drugs, to shut it off. Certainly something like, alcohol weakens the ego in the sense, quite physically, by sort of numbing the prefrontal cortex and then moving all the way down into the primordial areas of your brain. But even that doesn't really, it's momentarily on the one hand, and on the other hand, even if you're an alcoholic, you still have a relatively functioning narrative, unless, of course, it's a very, very, it's very much progressed. But even if you think about it, drugs like maybe drugs like ayahuasca or other psychedelic drugs can momentarily tear down the walls of the ego, if you will, but it'll always come back. Like, there's no way you can keep it off in a way. And you can't live this life without an ego simply because you wouldn't be able to move or navigate anything. It simply wouldn't work because there wouldn't be a story that you could, like, there wouldn't be a continuity. Like you couldn't, it's almost like, a good way to, that's why I call the ego the narrated body, right? Because it's this idea that your body as a whole, like your physical body, now this body, right? It doesn't exist, right? It doesn't exist as this whole. It exists as components. I have skin, I have a nose, I can smell, so I have all this different sensory input, all these organs that somehow work together, but this object, the body, doesn't exist. It's an interpretation of my own psyche, of the ego, right? It's my own interpretation. And this is important, at the core of this interpretation sits this experience of continuity, this idea that yesterday I had the same body and as I will tomorrow. And this precise experience enables me to move through the world meaningfully. And the same goes for the psyche, right? The psyche as this unified object somewhere doesn't exist. Like, I don't exist. I am a convolute or a gallery of complexes that are orchestrated or staged, if you will, by the ego and then represented to the outside world by the persona. And the persona being sort of the layer on top of the ego, so if you will, the clothes and the skin to my body, if you will. And the idea here is that you have to rebuild that in order to exist within any context whatsoever, unless it's in a coma or delirium or, again, a constant high or constant state of alcoholism. And the self punctures that structure, that rigid structure, that compulsion to always return. It compulsively punctures that to work against itself and consider the self, right? And consider the self with a capital S in this context, right? Consider the complexes, consider that which is non-ego, because that which is around the complexes, if you followed other videos, right? I made a video on how that is considered dead, right? But at the very essence, we can take away that it's not mine. It doesn't belong to me because I've encountered it somewhere. So I built it from some other source, constructed it around this kernel, which also doesn't belong to me because it's collective. So the ego is simply this interpretation of all these othernesses, right? And the self really punctures you to consider that and think about that. And to close this video, of course, this is only one perspective on the self, and there are others, and those are important, and we can go through them in other videos. And if you would like to learn more about them, please do comment, and also comment what your view is and what you would like to discuss or what you would like me to discuss. But I think it's an important view, it's an important perspective for the reason that it highlights this non-teleological approach to the Jungian self, right? It has often been represented as this something you can achieve, something you can kind of go and get, like the snitch in Harry Potter. I think that's not the right representation of it, right? I think there is something to the self that comes towards you and almost invites you like a call, and you can reject it, because otherwise, if you could just go get it, then it would be relatively easy to go and get it, right? It wouldn't be really objective. It would just be something else the ego can subjectively move towards. So with that, I'm going to close the video. Thank you for joining. Thank you for watching. Again, consider to subscribe and like this video and share it with your loved ones. If you do subscribe, consider to hit notifications. And we'll see you next time. See you in the next video. Thank you very much.